So, in my attempt to understand Jung's take on Christianity, I've been looking at his early childhood experiences and indeed the experiences of his relationship with religion and with God all through his formative years. And that involved, taking from the chapter in Murray Stein's Jung on Christianity, which is called the section called Jung's Relationship to Christianity, Part One, and the chapter A Father's Unfinished Work, which is originally published in Memories, Dreams, Reflections, pages 52 to 63. And it was rather long, and I did talk about it in great detail, with also reference to my own experience of living. And I'm going to continue from the section which is from MDR pages 215 to 215 to 21, so significantly later in his autobiography. And it's only 5 pages, so I'm just going to read what more Jung has to say about his early relationship with Christianity and in connection with his own father, and see if that reveals anything. This is about Jung in relation to Christianity. My memory of my father is of a sufferer, stricken with an amphotas wound, a fisher king whose wound would not heal, and that Christian suffering for which the alchemists sought the panacea. Again, the amphotas wound in the fisher king is from the Grail legend, and there seems to be there's a certain kind of Christian suffering which is particularly germane to that tradition, those myths. Anyway, that Christian suffering for which the alchemists sought the panacea. I, as a dumb Parsifal, was the witness of this sickness during the years of my boyhood, and like Parsifal, speech failed me. I had only inklings. In actuality, my father had never interested himself in theriomorphic Christ symbolism. On the other hand, he had literally lived right up to his death, the suffering prefigured and promised by Christ, without ever becoming aware that this was a consequence of the imitation of Christ. He regarded his suffering as a personal affliction for which you might ask a doctor's advice. He did not see it as the suffering of the Christian in general. Again, here we see Jung's tendency to his capacity to look extremely deeply into the life of his own father and to not only empathically connect with him, but to analyze what he found there. He's regarding that the suffering that his father experienced in relation to the faith was a particularly Christian, quote, personal affliction, but that his father didn't see it in that way. Jung feels that this kind of suffering is a consequence of the imitation of Christ, and literally something that's prefigured and promised by Christ. Interestingly, there's also the notion that there is, in fact, theriomorphic Christ symbolism. I've talked in other contexts about the culturally widespread practice or practice, I don't know, phenomena of theriomorphism turning into an animal in collective ritual in particular. And so it's extremely interesting to me that it should show up in relation to Christ symbolism. It would make sense. Anyway, let's move on. The words of Galatians 2:20, quote, I live, yet not I, but Christ liveth in me, never penetrated his mind in their full significance. For any thinking about religious matters sent shudders of horror through him. He wanted to rest content with faith, but faith broke faith with him. Such is frequently the reward of the sacrifice of the intellect, sacrificium intellectus. Quote, not all men can receive this precept, but only those to whom it is given. There are eunuchs who have made themselves eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. He who is able to receive this, let him receive it. Matthew 19:11. So again, this seems to be on the theme that the faith seems to ask us to give up the intellect and to just have faith, and that doesn't work for a lot of people. Quote, blind acceptance never leads to a solution. At best, it leads only to a standstill and is paid for heavily in the next generation. The theriomorphic attributes of the gods show that the gods extend not only into superhuman regions, but also into the subhuman realm. The animals are their shadows, as it were, which nature herself associates with the divine image. So this is the idea, the observation that the gods, quote unquote, have theriomorphic attributes and that this reveals something about their nature. And that nature can be reasonably conceived of as, quote, extending. The gods have an extended nature above and below, what we call superhuman and subhuman. And that quality or that aspect of them comes from nature herself. Associates, again, the animals are their shadows, as it were, which nature herself associates with the divine image. The divine image. I would also say that in the context, this is in the context of the playlist on human origins, the whole point of theriomorphism in ritual was that one was able to take on an enantiodromia or reversal in one's identity. So, for example, where one was in normal life a human female who was available in a collective ritual space that was periodical, one would transform into a male animal who was unavailable. And that this such transformation, such reversal of an identity has a curative or compensating power. It has a renewing or restoring power because it helps us to periodically break out of the habitual personalities that we live in. I'm trying to draw out the function of theriomorphism, and it like the one in observing that there is that such a practice, such a phenomena is culturally extremely widespread. Going along with this is in the Human Origins playlist. I mean, it's not just it's not me who's saying that. There's a lot of anthropology about such topics. In evolutionary logic, why? Why is that? And um, this seems to suggest part of the answer to that is that um, not only does pretending to be an animal allow us to, through hunting rituals, hunting magic, and things like that, connect with prey, and so better able to track it and so on. But it's also an enactment of the deep enmeshment, embedded nature of our culture with the natural world that has a function leading to sustainable management and engagement with the natural world. That seems to be quite obvious to me. I think the development of our human consciousness is inevitably bound up with relation with animals. There's a great chapter in that on that topic by Maurice Berman in a book called Coming to Our Senses. Maurice Berman, I think it's from the 80s or 90s, in which the whole first chapter is about the development of consciousness in relation to both mirrors and animals, to the idea of reflection. And yeah, the idea that yes, that the idea that theriomorphism enables, yes, that the original gods were deeply natural and animalistic, like there's a through totemism and like that. So there's a way that these categories of gods and animals um, were not originally separated. Like the idea that there is a God who is just God is a very abstract notion. It took a lot of, let's say, development, let's call it that, to get to that point. And so it's not at all in the context of human evolution, it's not at all strange for gods to have theriomorphic attributes. I mean, look at the cave paintings, for goodness sake. And clearly, this does something to adjust our notion that the gods extend to this. Yeah, so the idea of a superhuman realm seems to be higher in some way. And I think the notion of a superhuman and subhuman realm seems to presuppose a kind of two worlds mythology that it maybe doesn't have to. In any case, as Jung said, blind acceptance never leads to a solution. At best, it leads only to a standstill and is paid for heavily in the next generation. The theriomorphic attributes of the gods show that the gods extend not only into superhuman regions, but also into the subhuman realm. The animals are their shadows, as it were, which nature herself associates with the divine image. And so then he talks about the connection between Christ and fish symbolism, which is a little bit tricky. There's a Latin phrase, the quote, Pisciculi Christianorum. I have to find what that means. It means Christian fish. Anyway, it's the original association between Christ and the fish, as in Pisces. Anyway, so the Pisciculi Christianorum show that those who imitate Christ are themselves fish. That is, quote, unconscious souls who require the cura animarum, meaning care of souls or cure of souls. The fish laboratory is a synonym for the ecclesiastical cure of souls. And just as the wounder wounds himself, so the healer heals himself. Significantly, in the dream, the decisive activity is carried out by the dead upon the dead, in the world beyond consciousness, that is, in the unconscious. Significantly, in the dream, the decisive activity is carried out by the dead upon the dead, in the world beyond consciousness, that is, in the unconscious. It's not quite clear to me what he means by the decisive activity is carried out by the dead. So we'll move on because we're not going to find the answer to that. At that stage of my life, therefore, I was still not conscious of an essential aspect of my task, nor would I have been able to give a satisfactory interpretation of the dream. So he seems to be trying to understand a certain dream that we maybe don't have access to here, that we haven't been told by Mary Stein. Anyway, he says, I could only sense its meaning. I still had to overcome the greatest inner resistances before I could write answer to Job. The inner root of this book is to be found in Ion. There I had dealt with the psychology of Christianity, and Job is a kind of prefiguration of Christ. The link between them is the idea of suffering. Christ is the suffering servant of God, and so is Job. In the case of Christ, the sins of the world are the cause of suffering. And the suffering of the Christian is the general answer. This leads inescapably to the question, who is responsible for these sins? In the final analysis, it is God who created the world and its sins, and who therefore became Christ in order to suffer the fate of humanity. This leads inescapably to the question, who is responsible for these sins, the sins of the world? It does seem to be an inescapable question that many people do come to. The idea that there is someone that could be responsible is a certain answer to that question. But I think both of those questionings, whether there's someone to blame or not, the observation of the sins of the world are very real. And I could understand that in a theism, one could observe the sufferings of the world and end up blaming God logically, if no other way. As Jung says, in the final analysis, it's God who created the world and its sins, and who therefore became Christ in order to suffer the fate of humanity. But just because we're not privy to the reasons doesn't mean there aren't reasons. But yes, I can admit that it's a tall order to simply accept that fall back into the humility of, well, we don't know why, but there must be a reason. Well, how do we know that there must be a reason? Simply on intuition? Simply on faith? I think a better question is, well, I don't know. I mean, I tend to gravitate to the question of what can we do about it? What's the correct response? And it seems to me that seeking for someone to blame is not the best response. And I think it's clear to me that the best response is something that could look quite similar to, the Christian recommendation. But I don't think that, yeah, I think there's a temptation to suffering. And so I don't think suffering on behalf of the world is an adequate or complete response. But that's okay. Things can be partial. But anyway, Jung is asking who is responsible for these sins and taking issue with the creator God. And again, this seemed to stem from Jung's characterization of God as a person, as a personality. And I feel that this is projection in some way. I feel that this is buying into the notion that God is a character or a personality that can be taken to task. And I don't know if that's true. I mean, how do we know that that's true? I'm not sure it is. There's a way that I think one, by observing the suffering and evil and so on, can fall out with the notion God is good. But that doesn't necessarily that doesn't have to result in therefore blaming him. Although I can understand why it might. As he said, in the final analysis, it's God who created the world and its sins, and who therefore became Christ in order to suffer the fate of humanity. In Ion, there are references to the bright and dark side of the divine image. I cited the wrath of God, the commandment to fear God, and the petition, lead us not into temptation. The ambivalent God image plays a crucial part in the book of Job. God expects that God will, in a sense, stand by him against God. In this, we have a picture of God's tragic contradictoriness. This was the main theme of Answer to Job. There were outside forces too, which impelled me to write this book. Many questions from the public and from patients had made me feel that I must express myself more clearly about the religious problems of modern man. For years, I had hesitated to do so because I was fully aware of the storm I would be unleashing. But at last, I could not help being gripped by the problem in all its urgency and difficulty, and I found myself compelled to give an answer. I did so in the form in which the problem had presented itself to me, that is, as an experience charged with emotion. I chose this form deliberately in order to avoid giving the impression that I was bent on proclaiming some eternal truth. My answer to Job was meant to be no more than the utterance of a single individual who hopes and expects to arouse some thoughtfulness in his public. I was far from wanting to enunciate a metaphysical truth, yet the theologians tax me with that very thing because theological thinkers are so used to dealing with eternal truths that they know no other kinds. When the physicist says that the atom is of such and such a composition, and when he sketches a model of it, he too does not intend to express anything like an eternal truth. But theologians do not understand the natural sciences, and particularly psychological thinking. The material of analytical psychology, its principal facts, consists of statements that occur frequently in consistent form at various places and at various times. Anyway, he's defending his approach in answer to Job. There was a lot of pushback. The problem of Job, in all its ramifications, had likewise been foreshadowed in a dream. It started with my paying a visit to my long deceased father. He was living in the country. I did not know where. I saw a house in the style of the 18th century, very roomy, with several rather large outbuildings. It had originally been, I learned, an inn at a spa, and it seemed that many great personages, famous people and the princes, had stopped there. Furthermore, several had died, and their sarcophagi were in a crypt belonging to the house. My father guarded these as a custodian. He was, as I soon discovered, not only the custodian, but also a distinguished scholar in his own right, this is all in the dream, which he had never been in his lifetime. I met him in his study, and oddly enough, quote, Dr. Y, who was about my age, and his son, both psychiatrists, were also present. I do not know whether I had asked a question or whether my father wanted to explain something of his own accord, but in any case, he fetched a big Bible down from the shelf, a heavy folio volume, like the Marian Bible in my library. The Bible my father held was bound in shiny fish skin. He opened it at the Old Testament. I guess that he turned to the Pentateuch. I'm not sure how to pronounce that. I'm sorry. I should know. And began interpreting a certain passage. He did this so swiftly and so learnedly that I could not follow him. I noted only that what he said betrayed a vast amount of variegated knowledge, the significance of which I dimly apprehended but could not properly judge or grasp. I saw that Dr. Y understood nothing at all, and his son began to laugh. They thought that my father was going off the deep end, and what he said was simply senile prattle. But it was quite clear to me that it was not due to morbid excitement, and that there was nothing silly about what he was saying. On the contrary, his argument was so intelligent and so learned that we, in our stupidity, simply could not follow it. It dealt with something extremely important which fascinated him. That was why he was speaking with such intensity. It dealt with something extremely important which fascinated him. That was why he was speaking with such intensity. His mind was flooded with profound ideas. I was annoyed and thought it was a pity that he had to talk in the presence of three such idiots as we. The two psychiatrists represented a limited medical point of view, which of course also infects me as a physician. They represent my shadow. First and second editions of the shadow, father and son. We see here the association that's evident in psychology and alchemy between the Luciferian Mephistopheles and scientific rationalism that appears in the form of Jung's shadow. namely his intellectual persona. I would have to justify that further, but I'm simply stating it. So there's a limited medical point of view which infects him as a physician, and this represents his shadow. First and second editions of the shadow, father and son. So, and this is why, well, father and son, as in the father and the son, this can be seen to be, I think it can be seen from here, as I was sort of leading to earlier in the last video, that it's possible that Jung projects quite a lot of his shadow upon the relationship, the divine relationship between father and son. That in his attempt to, well, in following his sort of natural, what naturally occurred to him is like the turd falling on the cathedral that we were talking about. I mean, be a bit funny if no one knows what that is, but it's at the start of the last video. Um, that seemed to be a natural process, and that results in him sort of on his own without the benefit of the collective religion and so on. And I could understand why, in that context, that relationship between quote the father and the son, which was so central to such a tradition, could come to be a vestige or a vessel for shadowy qualities that are left behind, especially as for Jung, the shadow is Saturnian, meaning sort of old and slow. So it makes sense to me why that distinctly Christian relationship could come to take on qualities of the shadow for Jung. Anyway, as he said, the two psychiatrists represented a limited medical point of view, which of course also infects me as a physician. They represent my shadow, first and second editions of the shadow, father and son. Then the scene changed. My father and I were in front of the house, facing a kind of shed where apparently wood was stacked. We heard loud thumps, as if large chunks of wood were being thrown down or tossed about. I had the impression that at least two workmen must be busy there, but my father indicated to me that the place was haunted. Some sort of poltergeists were making the racket, evidently. We then entered the house, and I saw that it had very thick walls. We climbed a narrow staircase to the second floor. There a strange sight presented itself. A large hall, which was the exact replica of the Divani Kas council hall of Sultan Akbar at Fa'et Fatehpur Sikri. Okay. It was a high circular room with a gallery running along the wall, from which four bridges led to a basin-shaped center. The basin rested upon a huge column and formed the Sultan's round seat. From this elevated place he spoke to his counselors and philosophers, who sat along the walls in the gallery. The whole was a gigantic mandala. It corresponded precisely to the real Divanikas. Wow. So there's obviously a lot that's here. I'm not going to be able to get all of it. It's too late in the evening. And there's a way that it seems that the father and son not only serve as the sort of a vessel for his shadow projections, I guess I'm claiming, but also obviously the figure of his father in the dream is sort of also representing God, and is sort of in contrast to his father, his actual father figure, who sort of didn't really just had blind faith. It didn't really work for him. Whereas this dream father is expressing a lot of significant and variegated knowledge, like has a lot to say, this arcane biblical knowledge, like it's like, hey, this father guy is expressing something important, and it's his house, right? And there are these sarcophagi that are kept in a crypt. Several people had died there. Many famous people had passed by. There's a lot of significance that's going on, right? That's not quite clear to Jung or the other visitors, either his ego or shadow. Yes, and so this is all the origin for the problem of Job. And so yes, anyway, then we had all this mandala stuff about this circular room in the second floor of the house that was similar to this council hall, and the basin-shaped center is reminding me of Harry Potter and the Half-Blood Prince, Harry Potter 6, in which Dumbledore has to drink this hallucinogenic poison out of the basin at the end in Voldemort's cave in order for Harry to retrieve the locket, the Horcrux. And anyway, that's just what came up. The basin-shaped center. It's sort of the grail in the middle, the fountain in the middle of the garden. It's the feminine figure containing water of life, which is in the middle of the mandala, a symbol of the center in this case. Anyway, we're going to continue. It's not that further. This is 39 or 41. So in the dream, I suddenly saw that from the center, a steep flight of stairs ascended to a spot high up on the wall, which no longer corresponded to reality. This is like Truman Show. At the top of the stairs was a small door, and my father said, quote, "Now I will lead you into the highest presence." Then he knelt down and touched his forehead to the floor. I imitated him, likewise kneeling, with great emotion. For some reason, I could not bring my forehead quite down to the floor. There was perhaps a millimeter to spare. But at last I had made the gesture with him. But at last I had made the gesture. Sorry, no, but at least I had made the gesture with him. So he kind of almost got there, but didn't. Suddenly I knew, perhaps my father had told me, that the upper door led to a solitary chamber where lived Uriah, King David's general, whom David had shamefully betrayed for the sake of his wife Bathsheba, by commanding his soldiers to abandon Uriah in the face of the enemy. Okay, that was quote unquote the highest presence, I think. And now it's out of the dream. So now Jung says, I must make a few explanatory remarks concerning this dream. The initial scene describes how the unconscious task, which I had left to my father, that is, to the unconscious, that's interesting, was working out. So the father is a symbol of the unconscious, which is where all this variegated knowledge and all these secrets came from. Okay, so the unconscious is God. This reinforces that association. Anyway, so he said, the initial scene describes how the unconscious task, which I had left to my father, that is, to the unconscious, was working out. He was obviously engrossed in the Bible, Genesis, and eager to communicate his insights. This would correspond with there's an episode in my series on the Red Book called Mysterium Encounter, which is at the end of part 1 of the Red Book, Liber Primus. And it has a different photo than the rest of the episodes. And it goes into the theme of the connection between Jung's unconscious and Genesis in great detail, namely in connection of Eros and Logos as connected with feeling and intuition or forethought. Anyway, so it would make sense to me that Jung's unconscious was engrossed in Genesis and, quote, eager to communicate his insights. The fish skin marks the Bible as an unconscious content. For fishes are mute and unconscious. I think there are some conscious fish. I don't know. Anyway, my poor father does not succeed in communicating either, for the audience is in part incapable of understanding, in part maliciously stupid. So the idea being that Jung's unconscious does not succeed in communicating, for the audience is in part incapable of understanding. So again, this is the idea that we have to read Jung on multiple levels, and that there's an unconscious communication which is going on. This is the psychology of the transference stuff, just as much as Jung's quote unquote conscious argument. Anyway, after this defeat, we cross the street to the other side. Sorry, I just have to clarify. So Jung's explaining the dream. He talks about the initial scene in which his father is is engrossed in Genesis and wants to communicate something, but is unable to do so, which corresponds to the incapacity of Jung's unconscious to communicate. We could say either to Jung's ego or to us as readers. And then after the defeat, namely after the understanding, sorry, after the lack of understanding of what, quote unquote, his father was talking about in terms of Genesis, we cross the street to the other side where poltergeists are at work. This is in the dream. Back in the dream, it's reviewing what's happening in the dream. And then he says, poltergeist phenomena usually take place in the vicinity of young people before puberty. That is to say, I'm still immature and too unconscious. Okay, so he's receiving this implication from the dream. The Indian ambiance illustrates the other side. That's according to Jung, that is, when I was in India, the mandala structure of the Divanikas had in actual fact powerfully impressed me as the representation of a content related to a center. The center is the seat of Akbar the Great, who rules over a subcontinent, who is Lord of the world, like David. Sorry, Lord of this world. But even higher than David stands his guiltless victim, his loyal general Uriah, whom he abandoned to the enemy. Uriah is a prefiguration of Christ, the God-man who was abandoned by God. Quote, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? On top of that, David had taken unto himself Uriah's wife. Only later did I understand what this allusion to Uriah signified. Not only was I forced to speak publicly, and very much to my detriment, about the ambivalence of the God image in the Old Testament, but also my wife would be taken from me by death. Gosh. So this is all the meaning of this to Jung. So we're almost done here. Then he says, these were the things that awaited me, hidden in the unconscious. I had to submit to this fate, and ought really to have touched my forehead to the floor, so that my submission would be complete. But something prevented me from doing so entirely, and kept me just a millimeter away. Something in me was saying, quote, all very well, but not entirely. Something in me was defiant, and determined not to be a dumb fish. And if there were not something of the sort in free men, no book of Job would have been written several hundred years before the birth of Christ. Man always has some mental reservation, even in the face of divine decrees. Otherwise, where would be his freedom? And what would be the use of that freedom if it could not threaten him who threatens it? Uriah, then, lives in a higher place than Akbar. He is even, as the dream said, the highest presence, an expression which properly is used only of God. unless we are dealing in Byzantinisms. I cannot help thinking here of the Buddha and his relationship to the gods. For the devout Asiatic, the Tathagata is the all highest, the absolute. For that reason, Hinayana Buddhism has been suspected of atheism, very wrongly so. By virtue of the power of the gods, man is enabled to gain an insight into his creator. By virtue of the power of the gods, man is enabled to gain an insight into his creator. He has even been given the power to annihilate creation in its essential aspect, that is, man's consciousness of the world. Today, he can extinguish all higher life on Earth by radioactivity. The idea of world annihilation is already suggested by the Buddha. By means of enlightenment, the Nidana chain, the chain of causality which leads inevitably to old age, sickness, and death, can be broken, so that the illusion of being comes to an end. Schopenhauer's negation of the will points prophetically to a problem of the future that has already come threateningly close. The dream discloses a thought and a premonition that have long been present in humanity, the idea of the creature that surpasses its creator by a small but decisive factor. I won't comment on all of that. Obviously, we see that Schopenhauer's negation of the will was taken in from Buddhism and Hinduism, Vedanta, and so on. We see that the power of the gods is connected with the imaginal aspiration that enable us to gain insight into the creator. So polytheism is very much concordant with enlightenment. We have the power to destroy everything. How do we dispose our freedom? That seems to be the critical question, the question of the freedom of the will. There it is again. Anyway, then he says, after this excursion into the world of dreams, I must once more come back to my writings. In Ion, I embarked upon a cycle of problems that needed to be dealt with separately. I had attempted to explain how the appearance of Christ coincided with the beginning of that new aeon, the age of the fishes. A synchronicity exists between the life of Christ and the objective astronomical event, the entrance of the spring equinox into the sign of Pisces. Christ is therefore the fish, just as Hammurabi before him was the ram, and comes forth as the ruler of the new aeon. This led to the problem of synchronicity, which I discussed in my paper, Synchronicity and A-Causal Connecting Principle. The Christ problem in Ion finally led me to the question of how the phenomenon of the anthropos, in psychological terms, the self, is expressed in the experience of the individual. I attempted to give an answer to this in a book with a German title, von den Wurzeln des Bewusstseins. I can't pronounce that, sorry. Published 1954, and the essays in that book are mostly contained in volumes 8, 9.1, and 11 of the collected works, which are, if I've got that right, Structure and Dynamics of the Psyche, Archetypes in the Collective Unconscious, and Psychology and Religion. Anyway, so the Christ problem in Ion led him to the question of how the phenomenon of the anthropos, or the self, is expressed in the experience of the individual. And he expressed that in that book. There, I was concerned with the interplay between conscious and unconscious, with the development of consciousness from the unconscious, and with the impact of the greater personality, the inner man, upon the life of every individual. This investigation was rounded out by the Mysterium Coniunctionis, in which I once again took up the problem of the transference, but primarily followed my original intention of representing the whole range of alchemy as a kind of psychology of alchemy, or as an alchemical basis for death psychology. In Mysterium Coniunctionis, my psychology was at last given its place in reality and established upon its historical foundations. Thus my task was finished, my work done, and now it can stand. The moment I touched bottom, I reached the bounds of scientific understanding, the transcendental, the nature of the archetype per se, concerning which no further scientific statements can be made. And, in Mysterium Coniunctionis, Jung comes out with a whole cosmology. So there's obviously a lot there. But I think that can be taken as a study of the progression of Jung's relationship with Christianity that emerged from his original experiences and that came out not only in his relationship with his father, but first of all in Ion, and then later on in Answer to Job, and obviously collected works. Yeah, so it's collected works volumes 8, 9.1, 9.2, and 11, and then Mysterium Coniunctionis. But obviously all the way through. And these important dreams structuring the problem of Job. I won't comment any more about this. I have to leave it at that. Difficult stuff. All right.